In the prior lecture, we began with a discussion of what it means to be human. What are the special characteristics of our very unique species? Our focus was on trying to recognize advanced cognition and prosociality. We then reviewed the first half of human evolution up to the emergence of early Homo, specifically with the goal of trying to determine when and under what contexts those special characteristics evolved. In this lecture, we will study the latter half of human origins, the emergence of modern humans. As we learned before, there was an out of Africa 1 that occurred sometime around 1.8 million years ago. We know that at this time, hominins spread to eastern and western Eurasia out of Africa. The most spectacular site providing evidence for out of Africa 1 is the site of Dmanisi in the modern country of Georgia. Here are found a series of very complete crania and some rare stone tools of early Homo. Further evidence for out of Africa 1 comes from the presence of a very late occurring hominin on the island of Flores in Indonesia. This extremely primitive species lived on this island in isolation until about 18,000 years ago. It had a small brain, and the anatomy suggests that it was an isolated survivor of the first migration out of Africa. Once it got on the island, it apparently suffered from a condition called island dwarfing, where species isolated on islands grow smaller over time. Even elephants on the island shrunk to a small size. In our review of the evidence for early hominin evolution in the prior lecture, we concluded there was little evidence for the uniquely human prosocial and advanced cognition characteristics prior to 500,000 years ago. Now that we are approaching in time the evolution of modern humans, let's revisit and explore those uniquely human characters again. Let's focus in on prosocial behavior, the proclivity to cooperate extensively with non-kin. How does this express itself among modern humans? We have strong social norms and rules of conduct that make it possible to live in groups. We practice alloparenting. Many adults help in the rearing of the young. And we have extended social networks that we draw on for aid in times of difficulty and war. We also have social structures with increased network size. Within groups, we have pair bonding, which forms the basis of extended kin recognition, and reciprocal exogamy. This is formal out-group pair bonding with exchange between groups. We often refer to these collectively as cooperative breeding. One of the most important and crucial outcomes of high levels of prosociality is the large extra-family networks that humans construct. Ethnographic studies of all hunter-gatherers, which is the economy that humans evolved in, show a universal, deep social structure shared by all. One aspect of this universality is the presence of the ethno-linguistic group, or sometimes better known as the tribe. There are several common characteristics to tribes among hunter-gatherers, and I have listed them on this slide. Tribes speak a language that differs from another tribe, and they tend to exchange mates only within the tribe. The result, verifiable by recent genetic studies, is they are recognizable genetically as a group. Importantly, they are commonly recognizable through material culture. They symbol tribal affiliation with style. For example, among modern Bushmen or Khoisan of the arid lands of southern Africa, the different ethno-linguistic groups have differently shaped arrows. Their ethno-linguistic affiliation is recognizable by the shape of the arrowhead. Let's now turn once again to the paleoanthropological evidence and see if we can determine when and how these conditions of human uniqueness arose. Around 1.6 million years ago, there's a fairly substantial change in the anatomy and material record for early humans. We recognize a new species, and it is called Homo erectus. Present from Africa to Eastern Asia, Homo erectus had a brain substantially larger than previous, reaching up to 1,000 to 1,200 cubic centimeters. The postcrania is very similar to modern humans in proportions. This animal was not spending any time in the trees. It was strongly muscled, but overall fully modern in the postcranial anatomy. While it had a large brain, the cranium did not look modern. having a projecting, or what we call prognathic face, a low sloping forehead, and a very large bar of bone across the top of the eyes. The bone suggests it was heavily muscled and powerful. You would not want to meet this guy in a dark alley. There is an outstanding and nearly complete skeleton from Kenya that is an adolescent boy dating to 1.5 million years ago. Such complete skeletons tell us a lot about body proportions, and we can see that from the neck down, this is essentially a modern human. The stone tools that overlap in time with Homo erectus show a major change relative to the old one. The key is that the tools are flaked on two sides, what we call a biface, and they are often shaped in a way that is done with a clear plan to create a final form. The shape looks like an axe, and since most of them would fit in your hand, they are called hand axes. This slide shows some very early hand axes from Olduvai Gorge. They date to about 1.4 million years ago. Another less numerous tool form of Acheulean stone tool is the cleaver, shown here. A cleaver is a hand axe with a long, flat cutting edge. Through time, the hand axes become more refined in form, and as these specimens that date to about 500,000 years ago clearly show, the edges are often quite straight and the forms very symmetrical. It takes a very skilled stone tool maker to make hand axes like this. However, we do not see any regional patterning in their shapes at this time. We still do not know what hand axes were used for, but there are many hypotheses. Some people think they were a multi-purpose tool, something like a Swiss Army knife. In a case of experimental archaeology, a scientist was able to butcher an elephant that had died at a zoo with just a couple of experimentally made hand axes. Other people think they were hafted as an axe. One puzzling pattern in Africa is that we sometimes find hundreds to thousands of hand axes clustered together, like at the site of Olorgesailie shown here. All those black stones on the ground under the boardwalk are hand axes and cleavers, as you can see here in this close-up. One of the continuing big questions in paleoanthropology is, when did hominins first develop controlled use of fire? Fire is a breakthrough technology that allows cooking and thus improvement in the digestibility of food, light for extending the social day into the night, and warmth so hominins can expand their range into colder environments, and protection from predators. We know that modern hunter-gatherers use fire to modify habitats, for example to stimulate bursts of grass growth, to draw in prey, and also to stimulate tuberous plants to send up a shoot so they can see where the tubers are. Importantly, fire is the foundation of our technology, allowing the production of pottery and the working of metals. The earliest strong evidence for the controlled use of fire comes from the site of Gesher Benat Yaakov in Israel. Dating to about 790,000 years ago, this extraordinary site has wonderful preservation, including even plant remains. This is made possible by the partially waterlogged nature of the sediments, which provide an oxygen-free environment for preservation of such materials. The archaeological remains were buried quickly, and thus preserve much of the original spatial structure of the remains. In Figure 1 above, the authors plot the distribution of burnt stone tools, and as one can see, these cluster tightly, and near those clusters are found burnt plant remains. The scientists interpret these as the location of ancient hards where people cooked plant remains, and in the process, their stone tools became burnt also. Because if this was natural burning from grass fires, we should not see these clusters. The archaeological record also shows that around this date of 790,000 years ago, hominids started to expand to colder habitats and persist in those locations, suggesting they had the ability to use fire to keep themselves warm. Let's take a moment to summarize the record between 1.6 million years ago and 500,000 years ago. It is during this time that we witnessed the first persistent occupation of Eurasia, all the way from Western Europe to Eastern Asia. Australia remains unoccupied, as do many of the smaller island chains, suggesting that hominins had not yet mastered seacraft. We have evidence for the controlled use of fire and occupation of colder habitats, but people have not yet reached the Americas. The technology does not appear to change much up to about 500,000 years ago, and is continually dominated by hand-axe Ashland technology. There is a lot of similarity between regions, so we do not see interregional variation that could be related to technologies adapted to specific environmental conditions. There is little or no evidence for symbolic behavior. There are no art, carving, symbols, or other clear stylistic patterning in the record, and so far we have no evidence for high levels of prosocial behavior, the type that characterizes modern humans. Around 600 to 500,000 years ago, there are some significant changes in the hominin lineage, and many paleoanthropologists recognize a new species widely called Homo heidelbergensis. The specimens illustrated here are from Africa to the left and Greece to the right. The sample of hominid fossils at this time are similar in many ways across Africa and Europe. A thick brow ridge, a long sloping cranium, a rather large brain, and very thick cranial bones. Modern humans have quite thin cranial bone, and what this hominin has looks more like a football helmet. In fact, one could easily imagine this hominid taking a large club to the head and its cranium resisting it quite easily. Bone is a living tissue, so it takes energy to build and maintain it. So this suggests that these hominids had a rough lifestyle that put a premium on adequate protection of its crucial brain tissue. The most famous of sites attributed to Homo heidelbergensis is Atapuerca in Spain. This cave site is in limestone bedrock and includes a series of deep chambers that sealed after they were occupied by hominids. Limestone dissolves with water and often forms caves and sinkholes. If you live in Florida or Pennsylvania, where such limestones are common, you may be familiar with these. These dissolved cave systems are called karstic systems, and they often have stalagmites and stalactites growing in them. The sinkholes often form animal traps, where animals and hominids have dropped in and died and form accumulations of fossil bones. And of course, hominids sometimes lived in caves like these and built up sedimentary records of their activities. The Atapuerca site was discovered when railway construction cut through the rock and exposed some of the caverns. This photo shows where the railway blasting cut and exposed the caverns, and you can see a wooden walkway and steel structure that has been built up to protect the caves and give people access. Paleoanthropologists have been researching these caves and the deposits for many years and have constructed a wide range of structures to assist them in gaining access to the cave's deep chambers. Here you can see those access structures and various scientists studying the deposits. Perhaps the most spectacular finding is the Pit of Bones, which is a 13-meter deep chimney where scientists have found over 550 hominin bone fragments. This represents the skeletons of at least 28 people. This is a very high concentration and is a bit of a puzzle as to how it formed. The excavators have argued that it might be a ritual pit where the dead were consistently thrown in. This is a highly controversial interpretation, but if true, would suggest ritual and thus symbolic behavior. There is emerging evidence that the technology of Homo heidelbergensis was more advanced than the Acheulean. Just last year, scientists including ASU postdoc Jane Wilkins and ASU graduate student Ben Scoville published a high-impact paper in Science in which they argued that hominins at 500,000 years ago were equipped with spears. They based this argument on two pieces of information at the site of Katu Pan in South Africa, dated to 500,000 years ago. First, the stone tool assemblage has many examples of stone tools we traditionally refer to as points. They are triangular in shape, like projectile points from known ethnographic observations, and they are of the right size for spear points. Some examples are shown above. However, analogy based on shape alone does not make a strong inference. This is the sort of problem that begs for experimental archaeology, where we replicate the process today and try to develop specific material features that allow us to make a stronger inference. Kyle Brown, shown here to the left in the slide above, is an expert stone tool maker. Using similar raw materials, he replicated a wide selection of the Ka-Tu pan points. These were then mounted on spear shafts, and using a calibrated crossbow they built, they systematically stabbed the mounted points into dead animal carcasses bought from a butcher. The calibrated crossbow measured the power, and the speed was measured by the radar gun. ASU undergraduate Kate Bird published in 2007 her honors thesis that developed a totally new technique for quantifying stone tool edge damage, and Ben Scoville utilized that approach for the analysis of these points. In the lower left of this slide, you can see Kate presenting her honors thesis at a professional scientific conference. In this technique, every chip and flake on the surface of the stone tool is marked on a photo of the stone tool, and then using GIS software, a composite of all edge damage on all the stone tools is created. That process is illustrated on the right. The idea is that different tasks, such as projectile versus cutting, should leave different patterns of intensity of edge damage on the stone tool. Projectile use should leave more damage on the tip, while cutting should leave more on the edges. If the damage is just random from random processes like trampling, then it should leave a random distribution. Ben did two types of experiments: random trampling of stone tool assemblages by a horse to control for the random processes of edge damage, and the experimental spear thrusting. The trampling distribution is above, under B, and the spear thrusting is under D. Note that spear use has a lot of damage at the tip, and trampling is evenly distributed across the edges. The Ka-Tu pan points match the spear use. Another assemblage is also presented, PP13B under C. PP13B is neither random nor tip biased. Most of the damage is to the edges. There is no experimental data yet, but it is what we would expect from cutting. The take-home message is this: experimental archaeology supports the interpretation that at 500,000 years ago, early hominids used spears for spearing. Let's now take a look at the overall biological record spanning the end of the period of Homo heidelbergensis and the origins of modern humans. The genetic record and its analysis has significantly improved our understanding of this final phase in human evolution. In the slide shown here, I have divided the world into two geographic units and two major genetic lineages: the Eurasian archaic lineage, and Africa and the modern African human lineage. At the bottom, I have put the Antarctic ice core climate record. When the line is low and in the blue, the world is in a cold glacial phase, and when it is up in the red, it is in a warm interglacial phase. We are currently in a warm interglacial phase, and the take-home message from this graph is that most of the latter part of human origins has been spent in glacial conditions. The genetic record tells us that the Eurasian archaic lineage and the African modern human lineage share a common ancestor around 700,000 years ago, and that between 700 and 400,000 years ago, there was a significant amount of gene flow. This kept them from diverging into separate species, and most scientists would call the species Homo heidelbergensis. Around 400,000 years ago, that gene flow was cut, and these two lineages began diverging into separate species. Neanderthals arise around 200,000 years ago in Western Eurasia, and a third lineage, called the Denisovans, arises in Eastern Asia. At around 200,000 years ago, the modern human lineage appears, as well as shown in both the genetics and the fossil record. Note that modern humans appear during a long cold phase called marine isotope stage 6. Around 60,000 years ago, a small founder population of Africans, and of course these are modern humans, leaves Africa. They are the founder population for all modern Eurasians, and this small population interbred with Neanderthals, with the result that all living Eurasians carry a small amount of Neanderthal DNA. They spread east and west, diverging into different lineages, and some members of the eastern spreading population interbred with Denisovans. There is evidence that some ancient African lineages interbred with Africans. The end result of this modern human diaspora was that Neanderthals, Denisovans, and any other undiscovered hominin lineages that were in Eurasia went extinct, and only modern humans remain as the representative of the many species of hominins that once populated the planet. So our biological record shows that modern humans were present by around 200,000 years ago, but were they behaviorally modern? When do we see the appearance of prosociality and cognition equivalent to modern humans? To approach this question, we need good proxies for their recognition, so let's take a look at what these might be. The advanced cognition of modern humans regularly expresses itself in symbolic behavior, and symbolic behavior is recognized in the material world in the form of art, such as this rock art from South Africa. But modern humans also express symbolic behavior in ways that would be invisible to the archaeologist. For example, these young Hadza girls have scarifications on their face that symbol group affiliation. But these are, of course, invisible to the archaeologist. However, they also wear beaded necklaces. And note that there are differences in size of the ostrich eggshell beads and the presence of seeds in the necklace. Ornaments are visible to the archaeologist and are clear signs of symbolic behavior. Modern humans are also very creative. They recognize novel associations between unrelated phenomena. These are the genius moments that people often have, such as the moment when someone visualized a hook and a circle and invented Velcro. On the left you see a grub. When mashed up and applied to the arrow shaft, as this bushman is doing on the right, this creates a deadly poison that allows him to kill even the biggest animal on the landscape. Any hunter will tell you that the most dangerous moment in the kill is the final act. An animal lies wounded and furious on the ground as the hunter approaches. Its instinct screams in its brain to lurch to its feet one last time and bury its horns in your guts, and sometimes it does. The animal pierced by that poisoned dart falls paralyzed to the ground, so the hunter can calmly approach and dispatch it with safety. This is a breakthrough adaptation. A reflection of the pro-social proclivities of modern humans are their tendency to form social networks and groups, and the obvious expression of these groups are ethno-linguistic units. Among modern hunter-gatherers, these ethno-linguistic groups are typically quite small, sometimes 500 or so individuals, and they tend to marry within these groups and compete with other groups. Such groups typically express their ethno-linguistic affiliation through style. In a classic study, Polly Wiesner showed that different groups of Bushmen, Khoisan, indicate their group identity through the shapes of their arrow points. So when we see regionally distinct styles, these may be reflecting group formation. In the last 20 years, the archaeological record on the coast of South Africa has consistently shown a pattern of evidence for these complex behaviors we consider indicative of modern humans. Throughout that time, I have been leading a project on that coast, and our project has been a major contributor to this new knowledge. I will use that record and examples from my team's own research to explain to you what we have learned about the behavior of these earliest modern humans. This graph shows a simplified chronology of the major archaeological sites in South Africa that have contributed to this record. My team has been working at Pinnacle Point since 1999, shown here in red. There we have a series of sites that we have excavated as well as many more that remain unstudied. Note that Pinnacle Point has the longest record of all of these sites, and importantly, has the one site that has archaeological sediments that date to near the origin point of our lineage, about 160,000 years ago. This site is called PP13B and is indicated here. Note that it occurs just above the rocky coast of the Indian Ocean. Our first major result was published in 2007 in Nature, where we documented the earliest evidence yet known for people systematically using coastal resources. We showed that by 162,000 years ago, people were exploiting shellfish from the rocky intertidal zone. We even found the remains of whale barnacles. These are species of barnacles that only live on the skin of whales. We think that this is evidence for people scavenging beached whales and dragging their spat into the cave. From the same deposits, we found an assortment of red pigments that had clearly been modified by grinding. One can see the striations on them on the pieces to the left. This pattern is most consistent with grinding to create a powder, and we know from ethnographic accounts around the world that these powders are then used for painting the body and rock surfaces. This suggests that at this time, people were expressing themselves symbolically. The drawings to the right show some of the stone tools that were found in association with the pigments. In 2009, we published a second major result in the journal Science. We showed that people had developed a complex pyrotechnology by 162,000 years ago. This technology, called stone tool heat treatment, had never been documented to date earlier than 25,000 years ago. In this technology, Stone Age people in South Africa were taken a stone called silkreed that, in its natural state, is not particularly good for flaking into stone tools. But by carefully heating it under controlled conditions, they transformed it into a stone optimal for flaking. For example, on the bottom of this slide, one starts with the rock to the left, heats it systematically, and then flakes it, and it produces the beautiful stone tool to the right. What is the process involved? We've replicated it with experiments. One collects silkreed and wood to do the heat treatment. You then build a hearth kiln so that you can carefully control the speed of the rise and fall of temperature and protect the silkreed from the direct actions of the fire. This is best done with sand as insulation for the silkreed, and then one slowly raises the temperature to about 300 degrees centigrade or 350. You hold it steady, and then you slowly bring it down. We think that heat treatment signals two uniquely human cognitive capabilities: the ability to make novel associations, in this case between heat and a rock and its transformation, and the ability to develop and pass on long, complex recipe technologies. In deposits that post-date these at PP13B at roughly 110,000 years ago, we find evidence that people had begun to embed their coastal adaptation into a symbolic system through the collection and caching of what we call beauty shells, or seashells. These are shells that we know were not collected for food due to a number of reasons. First, they are deep subtidal species that one would need to dive very deeply to get alive. We have no evidence people did this in this area. And second, half of them have beach wear from being gently pushed back and forth on the sand. They must have been dead and collected. At a site called Blimbos Cave, which is just 100 kilometers down the coast from Pinnacle Point, the excavators have found ochre mixing bowls made out of shells. These bowls still have preserved in them the red ochre and the fats that were used as the binders for the paints. Also at Blimbos and other sites, excavators have discovered pieces of engraved ochre. The engravings are systematic and almost certainly represent symbols. Several sites preserve the remains of shell beads, which are clearly bodily ornaments. And dating to 65,000 years ago, researchers have found pieces of decorated ostrich eggshell. These are the remains of decorated eggshell canteens. As we noted before, regionally patterned projectile point shapes can represent ethno-linguistic groups. This slide shows examples of this among modern pastoralists in East Africa. At numerous sites throughout Africa, starting at about 110,000 years ago, we find stone tools being made with regionally specific patterns that suggest extended social networks creating regional styles of tool manufacture. These may represent the formation of the first ethno-linguistic groups. So let's summarize this evidence on a timeline. The material cultural complexity and patterning that we typically associate with complex cognition and pro-social behavior does not appear in Europe until around 40,000 years ago, and it appears to arrive when modern humans arrive. It does not appear that Neanderthals had this cognitive and social complexity. Our record in Africa now suggests that these proxies for cognitive complexity and pro-social behavior have their origins far back in time, roughly appearing at the same time that the modern human lineage does. So what do we know about the origins of human uniqueness? We know what happened in Africa, and the foundation was set early, but the final key features of complex cognition and pro-social behavior occur quite late. It seems that the final assembly occurred just at or before the origin of our lineage, sometime between 200,000 years ago and 120,000 years ago. The final slide of this presentation provides a list of important words and terms derived from this lecture.